It all began with a flicker of something that did not sit right. I am not the type of man who gets lost in wild imagination or looks for trouble where there ain't any. I have always believed in what I can see and touch, plain and simple. But sometimes, life does not wait for your permission to shake things up. It just does. The first warning signs were quiet, like a distant thunder you are not sure is real. My wife, Sarah, had been acting different, quieter than usual, like she was lost in thoughts she did not want to share. Then there was my son, Jake. He had a shadow in his eyes, something unsettled, something he was trying real hard to keep buried. I tried to brush it off. Maybe they were going through something, a phase where they did not know how to act around each other. But that feeling in my gut would not let go. It was not long before I noticed how Sarah's eyes lingered just a little too long when Jake entered the room. It was not the way a stepmother should be looking at her husband's son, not by a long shot. It made my stomach tighten, like a storm brewing on the horizon. Then came the hushed voices behind closed doors, the late-night talks I could not quite hear. I was not foolish enough to mistake it for casual conversation. There was something more to it. One night, I had enough. I waited up after Sarah had gone to bed, sitting in the dark, waiting for Jake to come home. He had been staying out more, but I was no fool. When he finally walked through the door, I was right there in the living room, arms crossed. His eyes widened for a split second before he smoothed his face over, trying to act normal. "Dad, what are you doing up?" he asked, trying to sound casual. I let the silence stretch, studying his face for cracks. "Where have you been?" He hesitated just a flicker, but it was enough. My gut knew the answer before my mind did. He gave me some half-baked excuse about being at a friend's house. I did not need proof to know he was lying. And Sarah? She was tucked away upstairs, playing pretend like nothing was wrong. I was done playing blind. Instead of pushing Jake for answers, I turned on my heel and walked up the stairs. I did not care what time it was. I needed the truth, and I was going to get it. I pushed open our bedroom door, and Sarah sat up, blinking at me, caught off guard. "What is wrong?" she asked, though her face already told me she knew. I shut the door, standing firm at the foot of the bed, arms crossed. "You tell me, Sarah." She swallowed hard, her face losing color, her breath hitching in her throat. She did not say a word, but she did not need to. I could see the truth clear as day in the way her shoulders sagged, in the way she could not meet my eyes. The weight of it all pressed down, heavy and suffocating. I did not bother hiding my anger. I reached for her phone on the nightstand, and she jolted, eyes wide with panic. Her hand twitched like she wanted to stop me, but she knew better. That hesitation told me everything. Unlocking her phone was too easy. She did not even try to take it back. The messages were all there, conversations that had started innocent enough, but had twisted into something sick. Words that should have never been exchanged. Compliments that had no business being sent. And then I saw it. The message that shattered whatever was left of my trust. Just one simple line, but it might as well have been a knife to the gut. "I cannot stop thinking about last night." The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. Everything I had believed about my life, my marriage, crumbled in an instant. My hands clenched around the phone as I stared at those words, burned into my mind forever. Sarah let out a shaky breath, but I did not look at her. I was staring at the floor, at the empty space where my future used to be. The betrayal was too big, too raw. Months. This had been going on for months. I thought back to all those normal days, dinners at the table, lazy Sunday afternoons, moments where I thought we were just a regular family. And all that time, this had been lurking underneath, festering like a disease. She started talking then, stammering out some excuse, something about feeling lonely, about how Jake made her feel heard when we were drifting apart. I barely registered the words. They did not matter. Nothing justified this. The thought of Jake, the boy I had raised, the son I had loved, made the betrayal cut even deeper. My anger burned hot, but it was not wild or out of control. It was cold, calculated. I knew exactly what I needed to do. Sarah's regret clung to the room, thick like fog, but I did not care. She could beg all she wanted, but I was not going to give her the one thing she wanted most. Forgiveness was off the table. Some things could not be undone. She must have realized it too, because her words faltered, her voice breaking under the weight of my silence. There was still one more person I had to face. Jake had answers I needed, and I was not about to sit around and let them stay buried. Without a word, I grabbed my car keys. Sarah's voice, tight with desperation, tried to pull me back. The panic in her tone only strengthened my resolve. I did not need her explanations or excuses. I needed the truth. The door shut behind me with a finality that left Sarah alone with her shame. Whatever happened next, she had no say in it. This was no longer her story to spin. The drive stretched on longer than it should have, every streetlight casting long shadows across the thoughts racing through my head. My grip tightened around the steering wheel, my knuckles turning pale. The anger inside me burned hot, but beneath it was something worse, a hollow ache that only answers could fill. When I pulled up outside the apartment Jake shared with a friend, everything looked the same, just another quiet building on another quiet street. But my world had been torn apart, and nothing felt ordinary anymore. I climbed the stairs, taking them two at a time, not giving doubt a chance to creep in. I was not here for pleasantries. I knocked hard. After a few moments, the door cracked open, and there he was, Jake. His face paled when he saw me standing there, tense and determined. He did not try to play it cool, did not pretend nothing was wrong. He knew why I was there. Without waiting for an invitation, I stepped inside. The door shut behind me, sealing us into the heavy silence. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed over his chest, like a shield against what was coming. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to stay steady. I did not need to shout. He already felt the weight of what I was about to say. I told him I knew. I knew about the messages, the nights he had been missing, the betrayal that had shattered my life. His posture wavered just a little, the mask slipping. I caught the flicker of guilt in his eyes, the way his lips pressed into a thin, uneasy line. He did not deny it. He did not try to spin some ridiculous story. The silence was louder than any confession. I pressed forward, asking the one thing that had been tearing at me since I had read those messages.
Why?
Why her? Why do this to me? His answer was not dramatic, not defensive. It was quiet, almost pathetic in how simple it was. He said he had never meant for it to happen. That it started with Sarah comforting him when he felt lost. One moment bled into another until the line between right and wrong disappeared completely. Hearing him talk about it made my stomach turn. It was like someone had taken my life, ripped out pages, and scribbled over the parts that mattered. His words did not make it any easier to stomach. He spoke about Sarah as if she had been some sort of lifeline, someone who had given him what he was missing. I could not believe what I was hearing. This was the boy I had raised, the one I had done everything for, standing there and admitting that he had torn my family apart for what? A moment of weakness? Some twisted sense of comfort? I felt sick, not just with him, but with her, with myself, with everything. My anger surged, sharp and unrelenting. I told him there was no excuse, no way to justify what he had done. He did not cry, but I could see he wanted to. Instead, he whispered that he never wanted to hurt me. But that did not matter. The room felt too small, the air too thick with everything left unsaid. I told him I was done listening to his self-pity, done with his pitiful attempts to explain away the inexcusable. Then I turned and left. As I walked back to my car, the night air felt colder. The questions still loomed over me, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Sarah's regret, Jake's shame, they meant nothing. They had both destroyed the life I had built, and now they had to live in the ruins of what they had done. But this was not over. Not by a long shot. The drive home felt heavier, like the weight of everything that had happened was settling into my bones. My conversation with Jake kept replaying in my mind, each word fueling my fury. There was no clarity, no moment of peace. Just the undeniable truth. I had been betrayed, and no amount of remorse or explanation would ever erase that. When I pulled into the driveway, the house stood before me, a reminder of what had been shattered inside it. Sarah was waiting at the window, her shadow stiff and unmoving. The second I stepped through the door, she was there, hovering like a ghost. Her face was drawn, eyes hollow. It was as if the weight of her own guilt had aged her overnight. I did not acknowledge her. I walked past her without a word. She trailed after me, muttering half-formed sentences, apologies, explanations, desperate little scraps of regret. I ignored them. She did not deserve my attention. In the kitchen, I stopped abruptly, gripping the counter like it could anchor me. The silence between us grew heavier. When I finally turned, I met her gaze head-on. Her eyes searched mine, maybe for understanding, maybe for forgiveness. She would find neither. She spoke softly, like she was afraid of breaking whatever fragile thread still tied us together. She told me she had made a terrible mistake, that she hated herself for what she had done. She said she was ashamed, that if she could take it back, she would. Her words rang empty. They had been rehearsed, polished, as if she thought the right combination might undo the damage. But there were no magic words. No way to erase what had happened. I told her as much. Made it clear that her guilt did not absolve her, that feeling sorry did not undo the choices she had made. She wanted me to believe this was some momentary lapse in judgment, a mistake made in weakness. But weakness was not an excuse. It was just another flaw in the person I thought I knew. When I asked him why, he hesitated. His excuses sounded even weaker when he said them out loud. He talked about feeling distant, about how Jake had been there when things between us had felt strained. He spoke like this was some unavoidable tragedy, as if tearing our family apart had been written in the stars from the beginning. I was not buying it. I told him the truth he refused to face. He had made a choice. He had not just stumbled into this. He had walked into it, step by step, fully aware of what he was putting on the line. He had thrown everything away for a fleeting, selfish impulse. The pain in his eyes deepened, but I did not back down. I could not. He needed to feel every ounce of the devastation he had caused. He begged me to believe that he still loved me, that what happened had not erased the life we had built. He said he would do anything to make it right, but our home felt like a tomb now. Every corner carried the weight of what he had done. I told him that, and I watched the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He still did not get it. His regret would never be enough. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Then he asked me if there was any chance for us, if I could ever forgive him. I did not answer right away. I needed to walk through the wreckage of what he had done before I could decide what came next. I left him standing there in the kitchen, hollow and broken. The truth was, I did not know my next move yet. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened, he was going to live with the weight of his choices every single day. The next few days passed like a blur. I moved through the house like a ghost, haunted by the life I had once believed in. Every room held memories that now felt tainted. The smallest things became unbearable, the scent of his aftershave lingering in the bathroom, the mug he always used sitting by the sink, the sound of the floorboards creaking under his restless pacing at night. He did not leave, though I wished he would. Instead, he shrank into the background, as if his silence could erase what he had done. I was not the kind of person to drown in sorrow, but the weight of it all pressed down on me, testing my strength. But I did not break. Instead, I did what he never saw coming. I started taking control. My first step was calling Jake's friend, the one he had supposedly been staying with during those long nights. I needed to know just how deep the lies went. The conversation was short but revealing. His friend stumbled over her words before finally admitting she had not seen Jake in weeks. That was all I needed to hear. There were no more questions left, no more room for doubt. Mark was watching me as I hung up the phone. His face was pale, his eyes full of something between shame and fear. He knew now, this was not something I was going to let go. I did not say a word to him. I grabbed my purse and walked out the door. This time I was not looking for answers. I had all of those. Now I was looking for something else. Closure. The drive back to Jake's apartment felt different this time. I was not burning with rage. not boiling over with the need to scream or demand explanations. I had already gotten the truth. Now it was time for him to face what he had done. When he opened the door, he looked rough, drained, like he had not been sleeping. He knew this was not going to be some heart-to-heart. I told him to sit down, and for once, he did not argue. I let the silence stretch, let it settle into his bones the way my anger had settled into mine. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, but my words were sharp. I reminded him of who he was supposed to be, the boy I had raised, the one I had sacrificed so much for. I told him everything I had done for him, every moment I had put him first. And then I told him the truth, the cold, undeniable truth. He had betrayed me in a way no son ever should. His hands shook in his lap. He started crying, but I did not reach out to comfort him. He needed to sit in that pain, to feel every ounce of it. I was not there to be the forgiving parent or the broken-hearted wife. I was there to reclaim my dignity. He admitted everything, though I had not needed him to. He told me how it started, how he had convinced himself it was love, how he now saw it for the mistake it was. He spoke about regret like it was some sort of shield, something that could soften the edges of what he had done. But I was not interested in his regret. I wanted to know what he planned to do next. I told him he had a choice to make, one that would define the rest of his life. He could keep walking the road he had chosen, the road that would cost him everyone who had ever cared about him. Or he could figure out who he really wanted to be. Either way, I would not be there to guide him through it. By the time I left, his sobs filled the hallway. But they did not touch me. I had already shed my last tear over this. Back at home, Jake was still waiting. His voice was tight with dread when he asked me what I had done. I met his eyes and told him the truth. I was done letting them decide how my life would go. For the first time in days, I felt something close to peace. I was not finished yet, but I could finally see a way out of the wreckage. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. I half hoped I would walk into the kitchen and find it empty, that Jake had packed his bags and disappeared for good. But when I stepped into the living room, there he was, slumped on the couch, head in his hands, looking like he had not slept all night. His presence was a weight I could not shake, a shadow that refused to lift. I could tell he wanted to say something, but I was not in the mood for another round of empty apologies. Instead, I sat across from him, arms crossed, and waited. Whatever he had to say, I was going to hear it all without his usual attempts to soften the truth. He finally spoke, voice low and raw. He told me he had reached out to his brother for advice, looking for answers after I had confronted Jake. His brother had not held back, called him selfish, disgusting, undeserving of a second chance. For the first time, I found myself agreeing with his family. But Jake was not done. He admitted that he had thought about leaving, just disappearing, walking away, because he could not bear to face what he had done. But the coward in him, he said, wanted to stay.
To beg.
To see if there was any way to put the pieces back together. I listened, studying him as he spoke, trying to decide what kind of man he truly was, a fool who had made the worst mistake of his life, or someone who had always been bound to destroy everything in his path. He spoke about guilt like it was some great weight crushing him, but guilt alone was not enough to fix what was broken. Then he said something that made me pause. He told me he wanted to see Jake, to confront him, not to accuse, not to make excuses, but to put an end to whatever twisted thing they had shared. He said he had let it happen because he was weak, but now he wanted to close that door for good. A bitter laugh escaped before I could stop it. He really thought he could just end this like flipping a switch? As if words could erase what had happened? I told him the truth. He did not get to walk away from this feeling like a man who had finally done the right thing. There was no redemption here, no version where he came out looking like anything other than what he was. Still, I realized something as I watched him. A part of me wanted to see how far he was willing to go to clean up the mess he had made. Not for his sake, his soul was beyond saving, but for my own closure. I told him he could meet with Jake if he wanted, but I warned him not to expect anything from me. Not sympathy, not understanding, and definitely not forgiveness. If he thought this conversation would somehow fix him, he was in for a rude awakening. He looked at me like a man treading water, desperate for something to cling to. But I was not throwing him a rope. I was letting him sink. He had to face this just like I had. Jake left later that afternoon, probably heading to wherever Jake was holed up. The door clicked shut behind him, and the house fell into silence again. I sat there for a long time, letting the quiet settle over me. For the first time in days, I felt something like relief. Not because I believed anything was going to get better, but because I finally understood I was not responsible for fixing what they had destroyed. This was not my burden anymore. The hours after Jake left felt like the stillness after a storm, the kind where you do not know if the worst is over or if more devastation is coming. I stayed in the house, half expecting him to return with some pathetic declaration that everything was handled. But the longer the silence stretched, the clearer it became. This was not about his words anymore. It was about mine. I had spent so much time reacting to them, to their lies, to their choices. But what did I want? Did I want to stay? Did I want to burn everything down and walk away? The sound of tires on the driveway snapped me out of my thoughts. I looked through the window, expecting to see Jake's car. But it was not him. It was Jake, standing outside, hesitating by her car, looking unsure, tentative, like she had not already burned everything to the ground. For a second, I thought about ignoring her, letting her stand there, forcing her to sit in the discomfort of what she had done. But then I realized this was the moment I had been waiting for. I opened the door and did not say a word. The look on Jake's face told me he was waiting for permission to speak, to step inside, to explain. But I was not about to make this easy. He hesitated before finally taking a slow step forward, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. He started with the usual. He had not meant for things to go this far. He had not known how to stop it. He was sorry. I could tell he had rehearsed every word, hoping that if he said them just right, they might mean something. I let him talk, his voice fading into background noise. None of it mattered, not the excuses, not the regret. When he finally stopped, waiting for my response, I asked the only question that really mattered. Why now? Why come here after everything, when the damage had already been done? His answer caught me off guard. He said Jake had come to see him. But instead of pleading or making excuses, Jake had told him it was over, completely, irreversibly over. He said Jake had broken down, had begged him to move on, had admitted that he had ruined everything. Then, he dropped the real bombshell. He was not here for forgiveness. He was not even here for me. He was here because he did not know how to live with himself anymore. He said that seeing Jake fall apart had shattered whatever illusions he had been clinging to. I should have felt something like satisfaction, knowing their twisted fantasy had collapsed under the weight of reality. But I didn't. There was no victory in watching him unravel, only exhaustion. I looked at him, this grown man I had raised as my own, and I saw a stranger. Someone who had made selfish, reckless choices and now stood in the wreckage, hoping I could help him rebuild. But I was not his savior, not anymore. I told him he had made his bed, and it was not my job to pull him out of it. His face crumpled at that, but I did not soften. He needed to understand that some things could not be undone. Jake left after that, his quiet sobs trailing behind him as he walked to his car. I stood in the doorway, watching him drive away, and for the first time, I did not feel the ache of loss. What he had done had changed everything, and while the weight of it still lingered, I no longer felt responsible for his pain. He was not a child anymore. He was a man who had ruined his own life. When Mark returned hours later, he looked defeated, as if whatever small hope he had carried had finally broken apart. He stood in the doorway, silent and unsure. I told him to sit down, and for the first time, he obeyed without question. He did not speak, waiting for me to make the first move. I told him that Jake had come by, that he had confirmed what I already knew, whatever fantasy they had built had crumbled. And then I told him the hardest truth of all. It did not matter. What mattered was the life he had burned down and the choices I had left. The house felt unbearably quiet as he stared at me, waiting for the final verdict. I was not ready to give it, not yet. I needed to sit in the silence a little longer, to feel the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. But one thing was certain. I was not the same woman who had stood in this kitchen days ago, blindsided and broken. This time, I was in control. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Mark sat at the table, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. He looked like a man who had nothing left to fight for. But that was not my problem anymore. I was not here to save him. I sat down across from him, resting my hands on the table. I did not speak right away. I needed him to sit in this moment, to feel every ounce of discomfort without an escape. His remorse was loud, filling the room like a plea, but I was not moved by it. Finally, I spoke, my voice steady and deliberate. I told him I had spent enough time thinking about his choices, about Jake's betrayal, about everything they had stolen from me. I made it clear that their guilt was not enough to fix what they had broken. There was no apology, no desperate promise that could put the pieces back together. Mark listened, barely breathing, as if he knew my words would decide the rest of his life. His eyes searched mine, but I gave him nothing to hold on to. I was not here to make him feel better. I laid it out plainly. There was no version of the story where we went back to the way things were. I was not interested in pretending that forgiveness was an option. I was not going to rebuild something that had been burned to the ground. His hands trembled on the table as he asked if there was any chance, that I could still see him as the man I had married. I met his eyes and told him the truth. That man no longer existed. He had destroyed him the moment he crossed that line with Jake. I watched as the words hit him, like a blow. The fight in him, the tiny flicker of hope, died in that instant. He nodded slowly, like he was accepting the death of a dream. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I let myself breathe. I told him I did not hate him. I did not even care enough to hate him. What I felt was emptiness, the kind that does not leave room for second chances. I was ready to move forward, free of the ghosts they had created. He asked what that meant for us, his voice barely above a whisper. I stood up, my decision as clear as it had ever been. I told him he needed to leave. Not tomorrow, not after one more conversation, but now. He had no place in my home, no place in my life. Whatever remorse he carried was his burden, not mine. And just like that, it was over. For a moment, he did not move. It was as if he needed time to truly grasp that this was it, that there was no turning back. Then, slow and defeated, he turned toward the stairs to gather his things. I did not follow. I did not need to see him go. Minutes later, I heard the front door open. The quiet click of it shutting behind him carried a strange kind of finality. Just like that, the house was mine again. Quiet, empty, but mine. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the space where he had stood, where he had pleaded, where he had tried so hard to salvage something that was already lost. And then, something settled over me, something I had not expected. Peace. Not joy, not triumph, just peace. A calmness in knowing that I had reclaimed my life from the wreckage they had left behind. I knew there would still be moments when the pain crept in, echoes of everything I had lost whispering through the walls. But they did not own me anymore. Mark had made his choice. Jake had made his. And now it was my turn to make mine. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat by the window. Outside, the sky stretched into darkness, but for the first time in days, my mind was clear. I was not chasing answers. I was not drowning in anger. I was simply here, breathing, existing. The storm had passed, and I was still standing. And I would keep standing.